you so much, Tony. It's always such a pleasure to come and see everyone here at ICL. You are some of my favorite learners, and I really enjoy having your presence on campus, seeing some of you at lunch, and having the leadership that this group has provided year after year to remind all of us the importance of lifetime learning and always being open to understand new things. I think that all of us as a community are being forced right now to rethink some of the assumptions that we've made about politics and economics and the stock market and sex. And today I'm going to try and take just a few minutes to talk to you about that last topic, about our changing views on sex and consent. And I'm also going to save some time at the end for us to have some discussion about this, because it's something that's still very much in flux. How many of you saw the presidential campaign? Oh, that did not work. How many of you saw the presidential campaign when Donald Trump indicated that when you're famous, you can grab them by the pussy because they let you do things like that? Well, I know that this movement began long before that statement, because my grandmother, she was abused by her first husband, and she crawled out a window with a baby in her arms after she was beat one too many times. And she found her way to Hollywood, where she became a young starlet. And she told us the story of why she left the movie business, and it was because of the casting couch. And she explained to us when we were teenage girls that back in those days, in order to get a job in Hollywood, you were expected to put out first. And she did not agree to that power structure and that exploitation of women. And so I had that frame in the back of my mind, as well as my own experiences as a young girl growing up in Los Angeles, where I knew that there are some people who think that you can just grab them by the pussy. I remember being about 11 years old and being with my older sister, who was 13, and my younger sister, who was about 8, and a friend of ours who was about 15, taking the bus down Sepulveda Boulevard and then down to Santa Monica Beach with our boogie boards. And I can remember that it was normal to take the bus in the 1970s, even as a group of, teenagers, and even a little bit younger if you had your older siblings with you. But then I remember that coming home that day, there was an older man who I thought accidentally kept putting his hands between my legs. And I thought, oh my gosh, I am so embarrassed for him. He doesn't even realize that he's pushing up against me. He doesn't know where his hands are. And so I kept moving farther and farther back through the aisle of the bus, and he made eye contact with me and continued to pursue me all the way down the aisle of the bus, continuing to grab me by the pussy as an 11-year-old, prepubescent 11-year-old. And I remember he did not stop until I stood behind my sister's friend, my older sister's friend, who was the 15-year-old teenage boy. And it was only when I had a male standing between me and this older stranger that he finally stopped doing exactly what Donald Trump said almost 40 years later is what you get to do when you're famous. Because I understood even then that it's not so much, then being 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, that it's not just if you're famous, but if you have any kind of power that is greater than the person that you're targeting, you get to do things like that. But I had never told anybody about that story until a year later, after Donald Trump said that. And what basically happened is that the New York Times published an expose on a very famous Hollywood producer, one of the, if not the most famous Hollywood producer in recent years, Harvey Weinstein. And basically it came out in that story, and then it expanded over the next few months to the allegations that he had either sexually harassed, sexually assaulted, or actually raped over 24 women. Over 24 women came forward and specifically named Harvey Weinstein and said, this is what he did to me. And all of a sudden, in response to that revelation, and one of the things that I think was key here is that in the same way that Donald Trump said, when you're famous, they let you do things like that, one of the things that shocked many people is that when the Harvey Weinstein story broke, is that a lot of the people that he targeted, that they were famous too. That they were famous celebrities like Uma Thurman and Angelina Jolie and Ashley Judd. And then all of a sudden we started to realize that even when you are relatively powerful, relatively famous, if someone else is even more powerful than you, even when you're in the public eye, they can use that power to try and subjugate or abuse you. And so to me, this really became about not just sexuality, but issues and questions of power and the relationships of those who have more power than others. And so literally, when that New York Times story was launched, when it was published, there was a social media campaign that ended up spreading through almost 100 countries and involved millions of people, and that is the Me Too campaign. Now, the victims of Harvey Weinstein, they didn't invent the term Me Too. It actually has been around for over a decade. And the whole purpose of the Me Too hashtag is to convey to other people who have been victimized that you're not alone, that I also have gone through similar experiences. And it was to create a feeling of empathy and support for people who experience abuse, whether it's abuse of power or whether it's rape. And it arose out of an incident where a little girl, a 12 or 13-year-old girl, went up to a social activist, and she talked about the fact that she had been sexually assaulted and didn't report it. And the activist responded in silence, and it stayed with her, and she realized that all she needed to say to that little girl, and what she regrets not saying to that little girl, is 2 words: Me too. Because she also had been assaulted, and she also hadn't said anything to anybody. And she started to realize that a big part of the problem of dealing with sexual abuse in America is that we do not talk about it. We don't report it. We don't punish the people who do it. And so there is this shame in being victimized because there's no public acknowledgement or support for it. And so part of this Me Too movement that started a decade before the Weinstein scandal was simply trying to convey empathy for people who are survivors of sexual assault. One of the things that I witnessed among my friends when the Me Too campaign really took off last fall is that the men in my life had no flipping idea that when I drafted my own Me Too, basically, what you would do is you would put the hashtag Me Too on a social media site such as Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and then you usually, but not always, would share your own experience. So one of the stories that I told, I didn't tell just that one story. I did tell the story of the first time that I experienced, I don't even know what to call it, and that's part of the problem that we're going to talk about today. But the first time that I experienced that, you could call it, technically I'm a lawyer, so it's like, well, criminally, it's sexual assault. But in any event, I shared that story, but I also shared subsequent stories all related to that period when I was a teenager, 11 to 18. And then, my experience as an adult, I shifted into something else. Well, when I shared that story, my husband had never heard about those experiences before. My best friend's husband had never heard her stories about her experiences before, and other male friends came to me and said, is this really happening? Because my friends, my wife, my girlfriends are telling me that they've experienced this not once, not twice, but multiple times. And how is it that I can have all these women in my life who go through and on a regular basis experience being harassed, assaulted, sometimes raped, and not know about it? And I started to realize that, and part of the conscious, intentional purpose of the Me Too campaign is to break that silence and to let the men in our lives and let the men in society know that this is really widespread. And it's I'm sure that there are a lot of great guys in this room, and I know that I'm married to a great guy. And I think that guys who have grown into adulthood with a certain amount of respect for women, who understand the importance of consent, who understand the importance of the attraction of being wanted, being desired by a woman, as opposed to forcing yourself on someone who wants nothing to do with you, or at least not that to do with you, is that it's hard for you to imagine that there are so many men out there who view women differently, who view children differently, because we know this is not unique to adults, and we also know it's not unique to women, that men experience harassment and assault as well, who are viewing other people in a way that you wouldn't. And so part of what we were trying to do with this campaign is to help people to understand how prevalent these practices are, sexual assault, sexual abuse, rape, etc., and harassment. So the World Health Organization estimates that 1/3 of women around the world experience sexual violence at least in one point in their life. 1/3 of women. In the US, 54% of US women report that they have been subject to unwanted sexual advances, and that the behavior generally goes unpunished. In France, if a woman reports sexual harassment, inappropriate sexual behavior at work, she is the one who's fired 40% of the time. 40% of the time. So almost half the women who complain that this man is behaving inappropriately to me at work, the solution is, well, I guess you better find yourself another job. In Japan, 96% of rape victims never even report that they were raped. And of those, half of the cases are dismissed. So basically, you're given, the entire half the country, the entire population of men in Japan to go ahead and rape without consequences, almost all of them. And then in the US, the EOC reports that up to 85% of women experience sexual harassment at some point in their lives at work, but the overwhelming majority of them never report it because they're afraid that they're going to be treated like a French woman. They're going to be fired if they report it. So it's something that many of us have just learned to endure. So in addition to making sure that people start to understand that, kind of lifting the veil off of this widespread practice across America and around the world, there is also this belief that if we get the good guys to stand with us and to start to shout out inappropriate behavior, start to shout out against the objectification of women, that it can start to make inappropriate behavior unacceptable. But that one of the things that we find is that when women are ambitious, basically what happens in the workforce in studies that we've conducted of women who work, their bosses try to punish them, and they try and isolate them, and they try and put them in their place. If a woman wants to be successful at work, the single most effective approach is to have a male advocate, to have what's called someone who, sponsors her. So not someone who mentors you and tells you what to do, but actually someone in a position of power who says, this is the golden girl, this is a star, this is a winner, we need to give her as many opportunities as we have. And if he's promoting you, you are much more likely to be successful and not to experience the wrath of others than if you went to your boss and said, I'd like to be given more responsibility, I'd like to grow my portfolio, I'd like to talk about a raise. All of those requests lead to punitive treatment, generally speaking, for women in the workforce. And that's the same type of psychology that people started to use with the Me Too campaign. Is maybe if we realized that despite, thousands of years of efforts to create equality between the sexes, maybe if we started to get men to partner with us and be aware, the good guys to be aware of how prevalent this is, and they start to speak out on our behalf, maybe people will finally start to listen. And so in addition to encouraging men, the good guys, to intervene when they see a sexual assault or sexual harassment start to unfold, it was also hopeful that we could help them to start to talk about consent and how sexy consent is, how sexy it is for someone to actually want you, to be close to you, to give you pleasure, to receive pleasure from you, rather than, derive sexual pleasure from your ability to overpower someone else who is often, smaller and has less muscle mass than you do. I mean, it's like, okay, I can strangle a cat, no question, I'd get scratched, but like, how fun is that, right? And not to compare women to cats, but the idea that someone who is physically more powerful than you derives a feeling of power from exercising that power from someone who's weaker than they are, I'm thinking, that's not a great achievement, That's kind of insecure bully behavior. But in any event, and so in addition to that, we also wanted to have men and women, but especially men, start to listen to survivor experiences, to be quiet and hear what they have to say, because in my experience, the good guys don't really know how widespread this is and how severe it can be. And the only way for them to understand is to give women the opportunity to share their stories. Now, one of the criticisms of the campaign, and a conversation that I've had with a lot of men in my life, I was recently asked if I would host a discussion in my home on this topic, and it was by a male friend of mine who was one of the friends who had come to me and said, help me to understand this. And I said, okay, well, I'm happy to host this talk in my home. How should we structure it? I want to have diversity. Let's have, the group led by a group of men and women. I think I know I said women first. Let's have a variety of women, and then let's have some men. And he's like, no, I don't want the men to say anything. And it's like, I get that kind of, but I worry about an overcorrection to the point where we're silencing the other side. So I think that there's this fine balance that we can try and achieve where we invite men to listen to us and what our experiences are, but at the same time, we create a space for them to ask us questions and to share their perspectives and to say, I don't understand, can you help me to understand this? And when we tell men, if we invite them to a discussion like this today and we say, we don't want you to say a word, we just want you to be quiet, then I worry about them wanting to disengage from these discussions. But there is a goal of helping men or encouraging men to listen to survivor experiences, both so that they can better understand what some of their, other men are doing in society and how it's affecting, the women in their lives, as well as, society overall, but also because it is affirming to survivors to know that there are good men out there. Because when you've experienced this, and when you've experienced this multiple times, and when you've experienced this in a way that I might have talked to you about before, which is, with sex abuse images or child pornography, and you find out that everybody's trading in your images and stuff like that, you start to wonder, are there any good guys out there? And to have good men, ethical men, men who love women and respect them and treat them as equals, to have them take the time to listen to you and to honor you in your story, that can really help with your healing process. And then I mentioned earlier, taking a stand against the objectification of women. One of the things that I always struggle with is that, on the one hand, I really love being a woman, and I love having my husband attracted to me, and I want to maintain that role, in my romantic relationships, where I'm attractive, but I don't want to lose the other complexities of my identity and my life and everything to that one sexual role that is a really important part of our lives, but isn't the totality of who we are. And so there is a desire to try and help men to appreciate women in our full humanity, and not just as sexual objects or as props or as, a new territory that you could conquer, another notch on the belt, whatever it is. And so, the movement was intended to try and move men away from objectifying women. And I want to encourage you to, at this point, I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the choir with this group, but appreciate the totality of who the women in your lives are, and to take a stand against, speak out against the objectification of women that we see all over. So some of the outgrowths that came out of this Me Too movement, one of them were whisper networks. So what do you do when you have 1/3 of the women in the world experiencing sexual assault and not reporting it? Because, I just talked to you about what we're seeing in different countries where people aren't reporting it. And they're not reporting it because of what we see is documented in France, which is that they could lose their job, they can be fired, they can be shamed in public, et cetera, and so on. And so one of the things that's happened is whisper networks have developed. And whisper networks, does anybody know what this is? So a couple of years ago, I was asked to give an interview to Oregon Public Radio, and it was about a band in Portland who had a band member who was purported to be sexually assaulting women at parties, harassing and assaulting women at parties, at shows, after shows, et cetera. And so what they had done is sent out through the band network, through the music network in Portland, who like this type of music, that you need to make sure that you're not alone with this man. You need to make sure that you don't drink around him. You need to make sure that if he gets you a drink, you do not drink it, because some of the women said that they thought that they were being drugged, and that's something that unfortunately is very common. And so the Portland music scene actually had a list of like over 100 people. And they were actively trying to create a list of people who had assaulted or abused women at shows, after shows, at parties in the music scene, so that women could be aware and could protect themselves, because publicly it was not being disclosed. And so now the Me Too movement highlighted the fact that there are actually whisper networks in different industries all over the world. So did anybody read about the whisper network involving the university in India? Yeah, so you're shaking your head, yes. So there was a whisper network at an Indian university where some of the students made a list of the professors and the students who sexually harassed or assaulted other students, whom you should avoid at this Indian university, and the students got in trouble for it. And so this is part of how women are coping with the fact that they realize that there are good guys and there are bad guys, and you got to stay away from the bad guys. Your mom's probably told you really early, or maybe your dad's, to trust your gut, that God gave you instincts for a reason. And if you feel like you shouldn't be alone with this person in the elevator, get off the elevator. If you're in a stairwell, get out of the stairwell. And it's really important for us to realize that we need to support one another and hold accountable the people who are doing this. And if we don't give them an orderly public accounting or system in order to pursue this, survivors will create their own way to survive. And the problem with the whisper networks is that they are just allegations. There's no evidence other than, you know, and yes, I get, as an attorney, I get that oral testimony is evidence, you know, but there's nothing else. There's no system to make sure that people who are accused of sexual assault experience due process. But if the system doesn't work, then people will find ways around it, and ways that might actually be worse for the entire community than if a better system was in place. So the whisper networks have developed and become pretty widespread in certain industries, and those whisper networks, as part of the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, they started to out more and more men from the whisper networks who had sexually abused them or sexually harassed them, and that's when we saw the whole cascade of people resigning in, you know, on television and in different industries, and, you know, politicians. It was because the whisper networks were going public with who was on their list. In addition to that, we know that it has been this type of information has been collected for a long time in what's called black books. So black books are political books, and I think that we saw this play out at the Capitol recently here in Oregon, where there were lots of reports of a certain legislator who was sexually harassing women, and people noted it but kept it private. And in places like London Parliament, they bring out that black book when they need to force someone, blackmail them into voting a certain way. And so these black books become very politically valuable for political purposes. Did you ever wonder why there is a law in America that says you can't make a sexual abuse or harassment allegation against a congressman until a cooling off period of several months? Did you know that? Oh yeah, you know, sorry, you guys know about the, you know, the mass killing at the Florida school yesterday? Have you ever tried to go into the US Capitol? You cannot take a peanut butter sandwich for your 5-year-old in the Capitol, and I know because they took her peanut butter sandwich away from us. Like, you know, there are no guns in the Capitol, but, you know, we subject our Congress people to different standards than we subject the rest of us to, including with regard to sexual harassment. So you know, if there were an allegation brought against me at Willamette University by one of my students or one of my staff, they could bring it immediately. There would be no cooling off period. But if I wanted to bring a complaint against a member of Congress under US law, I would have to wait several months until I had gotten over it and coped with it, and couldn't do it in a heated moment. So in any event, and in the meanwhile, of course, they can add that incident to their black books to try and persuade people to vote their way in Congress. Now, or in the UK, where this happens a lot, in Parliament. So one of the other outgrowths of this movement was that the Me Too campaign encouraged women to speak out. Why wouldn't women want to speak out if they've been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted by someone like Harvey Weinstein or anybody else? Because of retribution? What else? Embarrassment? Power? Career? There are so many reasons, but like as an attorney, as a law professor, I'm thinking there's an NDA. There's a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA. They cannot say what happened to them, because what has become really mainstream in settlements is that you make someone promise never to tell anyone anything. And if you do, then there are penalties, and those penalties are usually at least the amount of your settlement and more. And so what happened was, as all these women were encouraged to take public their experiences of sexual abuse, a number of Hollywood celebrities pulled their money and set up a fund, a legal defense fund called Time's Up. And the idea is they promised the survivors, come forward, share your story, and if there is an NDA that you violate and they have the audacity to try and sue you, then we will pay for it. We will cover your defense costs. So far, no one's been sued for violating their NDA, their non-disclosure agreement. But that was one of the main reasons why many of these survivors were not speaking out, is because they were legally obliged not to. So now one of the things they're doing is trying to change the laws. They're using some of this funding to try and engage in legislative advocacy to create more protections for survivors so that they can report workplace harassment or workplace abuse. In addition to Time's Up, we also are seeing a movement in schools called Me Too K through 12. And what that is that we see a shocking and depressing number of teachers across the country who sexually abuse their students. I just had a call this week or late last week from a parent whose daughter is one of several students in a local school district who brought a complaint against a teacher for touching them inappropriately, and that teacher was removed immediately from the classroom and then was brought back a few days later. And the student is a straight A student, 4.0 student, getting ready to head off to college. The parents don't want to derail her academic career, and they don't want to publicly ostracize her, and they don't have consent to publicly ostracize the other girls who also said that they were inappropriately touched by this teacher. But they don't want to have what happened to their daughter happen to other kids with the same teacher. And so they're part of the Me Too K through 12 movement to try and raise awareness about taking public when your kids are touched inappropriately by the school teachers. It's interesting, I just came back from California, and I was working with one of the top attorneys that took on the Catholic Church, and I was asking him, you know, what prompted you to take on the church? And he said, I was a priest, and I kept being sent to different parishes to clean up after priests who were abusing, you know, mostly kids, it was adults and kids, but mostly kids in their parishes. And after 10 years, I kind of became the fixer and kept following these abusive priests. And after 10 years of it, I was watching them going to this center, I think it was in New Jersey, going to this center where they were being rehabbed, and then they would go back to the parish, and then I was being sent back to that next parish and cleaning up after another group of victims from the same priest. And he said, finally, after 10 years, I couldn't live with myself, so I took off the collar, I went to law school, and I started to go after the Catholic Church. And the reason why I was successful is because I understood how the Catholic Church worked. I knew what all the codes meant, I knew where all the records were, I knew where the rehab center was, I knew the people that they were treating them for, and that it wasn't successful, and so I had that insider's view of the Catholic Church. And I'm thinking, you know, this is exactly what happens is when everybody is silent and they don't say anything, and they're all part of the system that tries to fix it, and you return these people, you return the teachers to the classroom, you return the coaches to the field, and nobody's speaking out because no one wants to derail their life or their kid's life. And eventually you have what we're seeing with Larry Nassar. Anybody know who Larry Nassar is? Yeah. So, true story, 1999, I was just a baby corporate lawyer, and I sued USA Gymnastics, and it was the best deposition of my life because this really cocky president of USA Gymnastics was in a complete power struggle with me. You know, I was like 29-year-old, I was 5'1" then too. And, you know, this short, blonde, young woman comes in and basically holds him hostage in this deposition that had nothing to do with sexual abuse. It was a pure contract dispute back in Indianapolis. And I when I heard the story of what had happened with Larry Nassar, I said, I knew that Bob Della Rossi was a creep. I could feel it in my gut. So I did some research, and I found out that that year that I was suing Bob Della Rossi, that I thought he was such a loser because he was in a power struggle with me, that he actually was trying to fight the International Olympic Committee because there were problems with coaches abusing kids in USA Gymnastics, and the Olympic Committee wouldn't let them do it. So it turned out that Bob Della Rossi was one of the good guys, and I didn't know it. And this was happening 19 years ago, and I didn't know it because it wasn't making it into the headlines. And basically what had happened on, when Bob Della Rossi was the USA Gymnastics president is that literally coaches were being criminally prosecuted for child abuse, for child sexual abuse, and the Olympic Committee wouldn't allow USA Gymnastics to ban them despite the criminal prosecutions because they were contractually entitled to a hearing by their peers within the Olympic organization. So like even for those parents who said, I'm gonna speak out and I'm gonna destroy my daughter's Olympic career, even for those parents, they weren't able to get the gymnastics coaches out of the industry. And so when you and I think, when we're watching the news last month, and we think, how on earth is one doctor able to abuse over 150 little girls in front of one another? I mean, literally, he was committing these abuses with other people in the room. How does that endure for all these years? He had been doing it for about 15 years. To, again, powerful women. Like, these are our world's top athletes. I think the system is broken. The system is totally and completely broken when Bob Della Rossi can't get coaches who have been found guilty of criminal sexual abuse against their athletes. When he can't get those people banned, we've got a problem. So we now are seeing, the movement in sports, which they've actually had in Canada for some years. They have, a much better protocol for trying to control this sexual abuse in the sports industry. And then, of course, how many of you know who Shaun White is? Okay, so I'm a snowboarder. Been a snowboarder for 32 years. I'm one of the original Pioneer Shred Betties. And I was like, I don't watch TV, so I was like pretty excited with Shaun White's gold the other day. I wasn't excited about him using a Burton board. And I said something to my husband, and he's like, how can you say anything positive about Shaun White? And I said, well, why wouldn't I? I mean, he's a great snowboarder. And he said, don't you know what he's done to women? I was like, not Shaun White too, but yeah. It's like now we're seeing that Shaun White allegedly sexually harassed one of his band members. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, is there any place we can go? We can't go to church. We can't play sports. We can't go to work. We know that most sexual abuse happens by someone you know. So it's like we can't go home. We know that most sexual abuse happens in our own homes. That's where it's mostly prevalent. So where do we go if we can't go to work? Can't get on a bus, I learned that, Where do we go? So what we know from another offshoot is you can't join the military because that doesn't work either. So we know that they have an estimated 45,000 assaults in 2016, 2 years ago, and of those only 1/3 were reported. And we've been hearing stories and reading reports about what happens to survivors in the military when they try and out their abusers. And of course, there's also more and more emphasis on peer harassment and peer abuse that we're seeing among teenagers and college students. So I've been doing a fair amount of research recently on overexposure to toxic pornography. And by toxic pornography, I generally mean, I'm not an anti-porn advocate. I think that there's a place and time for people who are interested in porn to have pornography. But what I am absolutely opposed to is one, any pornography that includes sexual abuse imagery, children in it. And then I also have a huge problem of exposing children to pornography, particularly the violent pornography, the rape pornography. And right now, about 83% of pornography that's been studied has acts of violence in it. And so, or humiliation, acts of violence or humiliation. And so I'm really concerned about this next generation of youth seeing pornography, which has become increasingly violent, and now you can get to in 1 or 2 clicks on the internet, and having kids be affected by that overexposure to pornography, which displays unhealthy relationships, and then they start to have sexual relationships in college, and they think it's okay to be violent with their girlfriend or the person that they're dating. And then all of a sudden, we have all of these complaints on campus about people being too violent, people forcing themselves, people not obtaining consent. And literally, I hold those people fully accountable, but at the same time, I blame America. And I blame our porn industry, because that's what we're teaching kids about sex, because they're not learning about sex any other ways. They tend to learn about sex through exposure to pornography. That being said, there are all these nuances that are coming out, and they sometimes come out when, I'm hiking and I'm hearing from my male friends. It's like, well, but is there a difference, on social media, we're hearing that there's no difference between rape and a catcall, because both of them objectify women. And some people have been brave enough to speak out against this and say, no, you can't equate the two. And if that person is particularly a man, he is burned at the stake and told, this is a time to listen, not to speak, and that these little denigrations, these little acts of objectification of women and subjugation of women, that they add up to a lifetime of abuse. So all of these need to be treated equally. So then you have a feminist, Margaret Atwood. You guys know who Margaret Atwood is? Yeah, The Handmaid's Tale. So, won all these awards when it was, won all these awards before, and, incredibly popular novel, a dystopian novel about patriarchy gone awry. But she had the audacity to speak out on this, and she was immediately denounced. So, like, one of the leading feminists in the late 20th century, and she was immediately denounced for not getting it, essentially being anti-woman. And she wrote an op-ed recently that was like, well, if I can't speak out and disagree with you, even on like really moderate things, then is there anything other than the script that you're imposing on us that we can say? And so we've got all these nuances that we need to be thinking about that is creating the potential for a silencing on these issues, because it's become such a hot topic where if you say one thing, you can all of a sudden be ostracized for not being sensitive enough, for being too sexist, et cetera. And so we have to think about, okay, we have criminal acts such as rape and sexual assault, and then, child sex abuse, and then we have civil acts such as harassment, discrimination, things that don't rise to a criminal level where you could lose your liberty, but you could lose your money, with these civil, these acts that give rise to civil suits or civil liabilities. And then we need to think about, okay, well, and then there are things that don't actually entitle you to a $400,000 settlement or, damages award, where it's just like, what? Sometimes the person is just offensive, but it doesn't rise to the level that society says, yes, we need to protect you from offensive people. I mean, if we were protected from offensive people, we could never leave home. Like, and even then sometimes, I have family members who can be offensive. But, we have to think about, okay, is this criminal as a society, or is this civil where, the person's not entitled to a loss of liberty, but that the survivor may be entitled to some compensation, financial compensation, because this hurt her career or something. And then there's the, that person's just a jerk, And you don't get money for being around someone who's just a jerk, but whose behavior doesn't rise to the level of civil liability. And then, another area where I'm seeing a lot of conflating is distinguishing between rape and between assault, like when you grab somebody by the pussy, versus harassment, where you say, God, your breasts look nice, or, you could say it more provocatively than that, but, where you actually are saying sexual comments in a relationship where that's not appropriate, such as, with a boss, the boss to the worker, not the other way around. But, and then there starts to be the question of coercion versus persuasion and consent. So has anybody heard the story about the celebrity, and I think that Aziz Ansari, are you familiar with him? Okay. So does everybody know what Aziz did? Okay. A couple of people are shaking their heads, so let me just tell you this story. So Aziz Ansari is this up-and-coming Indian-American star who is a comedian, and he met this woman at a party, a young woman at a party. He's like in his early 30s, and they exchanged numbers, and he invites her out. They go out. He orders wine for both of them, does not ask her if she prefers red or white. He orders her white. She would have preferred red. He orders the same meal for both of them, and then they go back to his place, and he starts trying to kiss her. Big, sloppy kisses, and he puts her up on the counter, and she says, I'd really like for things to slow down. And he says, okay, and I'm abbreviating this because this went on for they were together for 6 or 7 hours, something like that. And he said, okay, well, let's sit down on the couch and talk. So they sit down on the couch, and he starts trying to kiss her again. And she pulls away, and then he puts her hand on his penis. And basically what happens is she ends up giving him a blowjob. She ends up performing oral sex on him. And then during this whole campaign of Me Too and Time's Up, she publishes an account of their experience and says, he sexually abused me. And people said, wait a second. Did he force you? It's like, well, it's not that he forced me. Yes, he kept putting my hand on his penis. And it's like, well, did he hold you down? Well, no. But I kept indicating to him with words and also with my body language that I did not want to do this. And it's like, okay, did he hold your head on his penis? And it's like, well, no, but he made it clear that he wouldn't stop until I did something. He just wouldn't let up. And then they said, well, did you leave? Well, no, because I wanted to get to know him better and start to have a relationship with him, but I didn't want to move so quickly with the sex. I wanted to spend more time talking and everything. And so all of a sudden, you have this huge cultural war within Me Too saying, okay, I have no idea what the rules are anymore. Because if we start to not differentiate between persuasion and coercion and force, then what do? So now we're at this place where nobody feels like they can say anything because you don't want to offend anybody. And I think that's the worst thing that we can do, because we have to find a way forward. We have to find a way to talk about sex, to talk about sexual assault, to talk about sexual abuse, talk about sexual harassment and everything, so that we bring it out of the woodwork. And if we tell everybody, if we make everyone so scared that we can't even ask each other what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do and how we can indicate what's okay, then we've done the same thing that gave rise to this problem in the first place, which is not talk about sex openly and directly and positively and constructively. So at this point, the movement is starting, particularly this especially got bad with Aziz Ansari. At this point, the movement is starting to be criticized as just like a witch hunt, where, you know, women are saying, I was a young journalist, and I was in my early 20s or mid-20s, and I went to this bar with some other journalists, and this really senior famous reporter stayed with me afterwards, and he started to kiss me, and we started to walk home, and, you know, he started to make out with me against the tree, and I didn't really want him to, and I was kind of drunk, and he was kind of drunk, and so then I went home in a cab, and it destroyed my career. And people are saying that person needs to resign, and that person, in fact, was put on leave and then resigned, because she wasn't the only one who told that story, but there were about half dozen young female aspiring journalists who told similar stories about this married man getting drunk and trying to hook up with them while both parties were under the influence, and them feeling like they thought that they were developing a mentoring relationship with this person, and then once it became sexual, that they felt like they were objectified, being denigrated, et cetera, through these passes. And so now people are criticizing it and saying, no, you are an adult, you are a woman, you are a fully capable woman with a brain, with intelligence, like, you have the ability to say no, that you have the ability to get out of bad situations. And then other people are arguing that no, we really don't, because everywhere we go in our careers, there are men. And some of those men are good men, and some of those men are bad men, but we don't know who is who, and we don't talk about it except through whisper networks. So it's like, how do we advance our career when everywhere we go, we are surrounded by good guys and bad guys, and we're always on the defensive? We can't. It's not an equal playing field. So with all of these men being forced to resign over not just sexual assault, over sexual assault allegations, but also about, you know, boorish behavior, inappropriate behavior, converting professional interactions into potential sexual conquests, there also has been criticism of this as not just a witch hunt, but actually anti-man. That, like, we need to not view men and maleness as a negative, that we need to not see interactions between men and women as potentially full of conflict or dominance or exploitation, that we need to be more respectful to men. And some people go even further and say, this is what makes a man, is that he's supposed to be more powerful than the woman, and that it is sexy when he asserts his power. I was having a conversation with one of my male friends, and he was saying, well, the thing is that I know that deep down, women really love to be dominated. So sometimes, you know, I like to dominate my wife and hold her down, and she kind of resists me, and she likes it, and I like it. And don't you think that's true? That, I mean, that's really, and you know, and this guy is like, you know, 6'5", 240 pounds. I mean, this is like big hunking man, and really attractive and stuff like that. And he's like, don't you think that that really is the female-male dynamic? And I'm like, I don't. Like, I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's okay for, like, married people to, like, consent to have that dynamic and to be okay with it. And it's like, I don't judge people if they want to do a little role play. But, like, do I think that that really is the essence of maleness and femaleness? No, I really don't. I think we're so much more complex than that. But I think that, you know, but I know that there are people who are out there and are reframing this the way that my dad did, which is that my dad, who had 5 daughters, maybe 6, like, I'm trying to think, I mean, he adopted, so I'm having to do the math really quickly, because he adopted a daughter a few years ago, so 5 daughters. He said that there is a fire burning inside of every man, and it's your responsibility to put it out. And that was my sex ed. It's like, you know, it's my responsibility to turn you off. And, you know, and I think that when we put that framing around men and women, that it really makes us vulnerable to the types of dynamics that are being brought out into the public with Me Too. So, so there is this view that the movement has become too anti-male or too anti-man. And then another criticism that the movement has started to incur is the view that we're not really being sensitive enough to those nuances between coercion and persuasion, criminal versus civil, rape versus molestation, and that we need to really be more focused about what it is that we are opposed to. And then part of that, it's the view that we are being overly critical, that we are overcorrecting, and that in so doing we are losing our legitimacy. Has anybody read the criticisms from France over? Oh yeah, they think that we are like prudes. They think that like we don't appreciate the gifts that we have as men and women, and that we need to learn to embrace our sexuality and stop trying to embrace this puritanical heritage that expects us to remove our femaleness or maleness in the workplace, our sexuality in the workplace, and instead that we just need to stop being so uptight. So some of the solutions that I've been thinking about, one is that, and I say this all the time, that sex is such a great thing, and and it's so beautiful, and it's a wonderful way to express and share our humanity, to give one another pleasure, to give ourselves pleasure. That like we need to be able to talk about sex openly. We need to be able to talk about sex openly with our partners. We need to be able to talk about sex openly with our kids, and we need to take the shame away from sexuality so that we can talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we have all three are part of the sexual experience across the lifetime. So I think that that's really that's really important. The other thing is, I think it's really important for us to be much more intentional and well-informed about power. And for us to raise our kids to be aware of, and ourselves to be aware of the power that we each have to subjugate one another, and the power that others have to subjugate us, and that we need to teach people how to navigate the complexities of a society in which people will use their power to hurt you, and the importance of protecting yourselves, and the importance especially of protecting one another from the abuse of power, whether it's a sexual abuse or some other form of abuse. But I think that so much of what we're seeing in the Me Too movement is a widespread abuse of power by those who are in positions of privilege. As part of that openness, I'm really concerned about the fact that there are people who are continuing to grow up with their very loving and devoted dad saying, there's fire burning inside of every man, and it's your responsibility to put it out, and not having any sex education other than that. And so I think it's really important to have sex education throughout schools, and that be a mandatory part of the curriculum. Where it gets dangerous, though, is that so much of the sexuality that our kids are exposed to through pornography is stuff that you and I have never done and probably never even thought about doing. That is just not part of mainstream experience. And now they're talking about, I don't know if you read the controversy last year where they were talking about the sex ed curriculum in certain public schools that this company was trying to sell. And they were talking about bondage, they were talking about S&M, they were talking about sex toys, and I'm thinking, I want my daughter to know what a penis is and what a vagina is, and like how they go together, and I want them to be comfortable with their identity so that if they're not straight, that they can come to terms with that and they understand, what that means and how to navigate that life, that not all of us are the same and that we don't want to be because it's dangerous, but I don't want them to be thinking at 14 about, sex toys and things like that. So the issue with the sex ed is I definitely want to see more sex ed in the curriculum, but I think I'm still old school, uptight enough myself that I'm not sure who gets to decide what should be in that curriculum. So in addition to that, I think that we need to really start talking about the cultural shift that's going on and the gender norms that's going on around the world, that a lot of this is embedded, no pun intended, embedded in a social construct that's not going to work in the 21st century. That people are not going to continue with all of the abilities that we now have to communicate instantly and the power that we now know we have to take other people down. People are no longer going to be silent as they're being abused, as they're being exploited or subjugated, and I think that we need to try and figure out how to promote equality both throughout our society and globally, so that we no longer are the haves and the have-nots where women have to put up with sexual abuse in order to further their careers, or they have to put up with sexual abuse in order to stay on the team, or they have to put up with sexual abuse in order to stay in school. So I think that it's really important for us to start thinking about the need to shift our cultural views towards gender and sex. And then, I've already talked about equality both in the bedroom and the boardroom, and the importance of working to improve equality in both places. So I'm going to start off the discussion during this last 25 minutes or so that we have together to ask you just a few questions. The first one is, if a woman tells you she wants to slow down and then she performs oral sex on you, have you done anything wrong? So thank you. I understand that we have microphones that are ready to hand out. I don't know if you remember the test question, because I am a teacher and so I do like to test my students. But the test question was, if a woman tells you she wants to slow down and then she performs oral sex on you, have you done anything wrong? So this is the Aziz Ansari scenario, basically. So could you take the mic around, please?
Depends on what you said to her in the intervening time. It depends on what you said to her in between the time she said slow down and until what she did. Because there are other kinds of coercion besides shoving your head down.
Okay, so can you give examples of what maybe if you need the mic? Okay, so can you give us examples of what would be appropriate things that would be acceptable for you to say to her, and what would be unacceptable things to say to her that would distinguish it from being a acceptable act versus a unacceptable act?
I don't think I can, because all I was thinking were the ways that he could be coercing her verbally. So I can't think what would be acceptable, and I don't know. Maybe that's for some guy to say. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
If she says to slow down and he persists and doesn't slow down and it ends up that way, then he did something wrong.
That's certainly what the woman who published her account of this said, is that I told him repeatedly to slow down. I said it verbally, and I said it, with my body clues, and he simply didn't want to hear what I was saying. And so he continued to pursue this, or persist, until he wound me down or wore me down.
This is Charlene. I'm just looking at the way it was written, and I have done nothing wrong. It's the woman. It says, has the woman done anything wrong?
Oh, well, okay. Well, it says, then she performs oral sex on you. Wait. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm assuming that the speaker is male. Uh-huh.
Well, I think having oral sex is slowing down. Because,
yeah.
no. Because, let me finish. Because any man here, if he had the chance, and he was young and virile, and was with a gal like this, he would want to consummate with intercourse. But she doesn't want to do that, so she says, let's slow down, and I'll, give you some oral sex.
Yeah.
And then, ooh. Now, from what I understand, kids nowadays think that oral sex is not that bad because it's not intercourse. It's not, so it's a level below.
You
And
mean-
maybe she felt she was slowing down. Yeah.
You mean kids like Bill Clinton?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did not have sex with that woman? Yeah.
Well, I was kind of scared to answer this question until Phil spoke up.
Exactly. Thank you for loosening us all up, Phil.
I guess from a guy's perspective, you could see he could make a case that he's trying to convince this lady to do it.
Yeah.
I do think the issue is how quick does he back off? And if you push and push and push, people are going to give in, especially if they think you're in a position of power. So I guess where I'm at on it, it's okay to try to convince them, but you ought to back off pretty quick.
We've got someone down here.
One of my approaches even to a question like that is what is the setting which it's occurring in? And when we talk about the power relationships, which I think are central to these issues, and power being a sense of a ratio of dependency, the more you're depending on the individual who can then coerce you into doing something, that's one issue. If this is a couple of people that met at the bar, and they decided to go home together, and that's an interpersonal relationship, then there may be a different standard about what you're dealing with and what the consequences are.
So one of the things that I remember my uncle telling my dad about, probably 30-something years ago, so I was a teenager at the time, is he said, my son's wife is accusing him of raping her, but that's impossible. You can't rape your own wife. So, like, when you talk about the relationship and that history of the relationship and the nature of that relationship, does that change what we're obligated to say to each other or to do to convey our consent and what's acceptable? You know how that, does anybody ever read like stock prospectuses? That past performance is not indicative of future performance? Like, we just went through some training at Willamette a couple of days ago. I'm one of the sexual assault advisors or whatever, or, volunteers, whatever the proper term is. And, and one thing that we're not allowed to consider is anything that had happened in a previous sexual encounter between these two people. We're only allowed to focus on what happened that time, when in this case, he did not give his express consent for her to anally penetrate him with her finger. And so he felt assaulted. It's like, well, last time we did this and he didn't object, so I thought it was okay this time. It's like, no, you don't get to carry forward previous consents. And it's just like, okay, so how do you navigate? I've been with my husband for 20 years. Like, every night, do I have to make sure it's okay this time? I hope not, because I haven't been, but I figure he would have left me by now if and not to make small of it, but I think it is important to think about relationships in context and is it different? Does it make a difference through the relationship?
It seems to me they're having communication problems there.
Yeah, I think it seems to the hearings board as well. But who is obligated, and this is part of what we talked about, who is obligated to communicate? Is it the person who's being pursued, or is it the person who's pursuing? It is both. And if somebody gets in trouble and after the fact the person who was pursued says, but I didn't want to do that, who do we hold accountable for the girl who penetrated the boy's anus? without his express consent. Well, exactly. And who wants to enter into an 11-page executory contract every time that we get excited? Like, that's a killjoy. Like, but no, but it's like, what do we have to do? You know, and this goes to, well, you know, this goes to my third question, which is, do you have to verbally consent, or can consent be conveyed through body language? Okay, so what can you do? For example, if I am with a man that I am not married to, and he's married, let's say he's married to somebody else and I'm married to somebody else, and he gets an erection, I'm thinking that could be interpreted as consent.
You mean consent for you to do something?
Yeah. I mean, if somebody gets an erection, then you would think, okay, well, obviously he's, you know, sexually aroused, so is that consent? I mean, has anybody ever not had control over their erections?
How old is this guy?
All the time, right? So it's like, it's the same with us. Like, sometimes we get wet and we don't want to have sex with you. You know, and the fact that we're wet doesn't mean that you get to have sex with us. And yet that's exactly what so many of us rely on in, you know, having sexual encounters with each other. Is we're looking at, is this person aroused based upon physical indicators? And yet we often don't have control over some of those indicators. And what else do we know about body language? Okay, one of my favorite studies ever. Let me tell you what we know about body language, okay? This one's good. So they brought together men and women, and they had them talk for about 15 minutes. And then afterwards, they went and they talked to the men, and they said, so what do you think? Did she want you? Almost 80% of the guys were like, dude, she totally wanted me. Yeah. Then they went to the women, and they said, so what do you think? You like him? And they're like, oh God, no, I would never want to have sex with him, right? And it was like the reverse numbers. It was like almost 80% on one side and only around 20-something% on the other side. So it was like major misperceptions of body language across the two genders in this experiment. It just like, you know, and it's so, when I read that, I'm like, oh, this is terrible, because everywhere we go, women, guys are thinking, God, she totally wants me, you know? And it's like, and some of you, yes, but like a lot of you, no. Let's just like study together, okay?
There are, I think you're right, there are different, I'll just recount. I direct musicals with college students, and a few years ago we did Spring Awakening, and we had to put on the audition sheet, there's a nude scene. If you're cast as one of the people doing the nude scene, a sex scene, are you willing to be cast in that role? Only one of the 13, 15 women said yes. All the guys said yes.
Yeah. So if you can't rely on body language, and you don't want to enter into a contract every time that you have sexual intimacy with somebody, how do you navigate sex in the 21st century?
Respect.
And how do you show respect?
Listening to someone's boundaries. Like, if she's saying she's not into it, maybe it's because she just wants somebody to listen.
Can we take the microphone down there? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just saying to listen to one another, and especially if someone is expressing resistance, to respect that, and especially how we're talking about power dynamics and how there is an imbalance of power between men and women in this world, and so I believe it's everyone's own duty to listen to others and actually tune into those boundaries. And I mean, I would personally would think it was very unattractive for someone to say that they weren't interested and continue to pursue someone. But maybe I don't understand how those people are viewing things, because it makes no sense to me.
So when you emphasize the importance of respect, that requires us to get outside of ourselves and what we want, and
Yeah.
make the other person the focus.
Yeah, definitely.
And what are we taught in pornography? How is sex portrayed?
Seems very individual taking focus, probably.
Yeah. It's very much self-focused. It's very much about, the stereotypical pornography. There is a whole line of pornography that is more focused on sexual equality, or so I've read. But, but the traditional pornography is very focused on male pleasure, where it's all about, having him ejaculate and having him want to, fuck you, if you will, and it's about you being attractive for him, and it really is about, kind of you being the flower that attracts the bee, and it's all about the bee. But if you're really going to recreate sexual relations around respect, then it requires each party to get out of ourselves and to focus on the other person and what they want and what's pleasing to them, and to respect those wishes. But that's totally contrary to what is portrayed in much of what we see that teaches us about sex. So where do we learn that?
Yeah, I think it's really tough when that's being flooded to our children and generations growing up, when that's what is being shown. And I saw Aziz Ansari talk about it, and he did seem confused by that situation when this woman came forward. But, it does sound like she expressed no multiple times, and there might be a power imbalance with him being a public figure, and she wanted to like him, and walked away from it and reflected and seemed very upset. And didn't she come forward as anonymous initially? Or
So
am I wrong on that?
Yeah, so I don't remember. I read after. I read it after. I hate to reveal my main source of news. I read it after the Saturday Night Live skit about it. And so at that point it had been out in the in the media, and at that point she had been publicly identified. So I don't know what happened the first time. I think that, has anybody ever read or seen performed Jean Genet's The Maids, the play? So Jean Genet's The Maids, I think it's really insightful in that it shows you that it was the female maids in the household who understood everything because they had no power within the house. And so it became their responsibility to pay attention to other people and the dynamics, the social and political dynamics within the household. And often what we see in group dynamics is it's those who have the least power who pay attention to everybody else because they are the most vulnerable. And so in sexual relationships, in the traditional portrayal of them in the US, it's the man who has the power and the woman who doesn't. And so it's the woman who's having to figure out, pay attention to the man and what he wants. And he might think we have a G-spot that we know we don't have, when really what we want is to pay attention to the clitoris. But if he's got all the power, then he's not paying attention, and isn't focused on your pleasure. And so part of what I think needs to happen here is, with the cultural shift, we need to start to empower both genders in the bedroom and in the boardroom, so it doesn't become the responsibility of those who don't have power to meet the needs of very self-absorbed, powerful people, thinking that this is just what I'm entitled to because I have all this power, so it must mean I'm awesome, so I get whatever I want. I mean, it's like the Nightmare Child, right? Veruca Salt? Yeah. So what about...
Could I?
Go ahead.
I wanted to add two things. One is, and this is an old study now, but they asked couples who had been married 20 years how much they talked about these kinds of things, sexual, and they didn't. And I remember thinking, well, if couples that are intimate over that length of time have trouble talking about it, how much more difficult it is to raise it on a first date or something like that. And then you talk about body language, and years ago I worked with students going abroad, and we would take time to talk with young women about how to say no when they were approached by a guy, because in foreign countries, the woman would say no, and it was very clear, I don't want anything to do with you. And women in the United States would say, oh, no, nah, thanks for asking, or I really don't want to. And that was a real come on to the guys. And so they would pursue it, and it would escalate that way. And so that's just another piece of a body language mess.
Right. And then we had the whole movement of no means no, because there was this cultural perception that no meant try harder, and we got into the bad situations that we read about just a second ago.
You reminded me when you were talking about G-spot, clitoris and stuff, was it Dr. Ruth or Ruth? Ask Ruth. She was great because she actually emphasized that. You need to listen to your partner.
Yeah.
And find out their needs and whatnot. I thought she was really good. And there was a Dr. Drew, I think, too, once upon a time. I think. It's fuzzy. But that seems to have disappeared. We live in a different age now.
Yeah. And I hate to say it, but we live in the porn age. I mean, that really has become the source of, so much of what our young people are growing up in. And the initial studies that are coming out about the impact that it's having is we're seeing a significant increase in erectile dysfunction among our college-age males. And I did a TEDx talk last year about this, and I was inundated with calls and emails from all around the world from guys who said, I'm 17 years old, I'm 19 years old, I'm 22 years old, I'm 24 years old, and I cannot get an erection except watching pornography. And I have a girlfriend, or, the Indian boy, I want to get married to a wife someday, I want to be able to consummate the marriage. And we basically are in the process of castrating our youth by immersing them in so much digital pornography that they don't have that opportunity to go. Did you guys used to do first base, second base, third base? Like, I can remember first base, and I can remember big deal when we went to second base. And like from first base to a home run was an 8-year period in my life between the first kiss and actually, the first sexual intercourse. And I think that's fine. I think like spread it out over your teenage years and So I get really scared because, when I'm talking to these youth, like some of them are 21 years old and they've not had intercourse because they've had 10 years of a sexual relationship with pornography. And that's it. And then all of a sudden they feel the girl's breasts and it doesn't affect them. They don't get an erection and they're like, what's wrong with me? And I think we've got to figure this out as a society. And I think it's too much. When they start to not be able to have sex with real people, that's when I think that we've got a crisis on our hands.
Hi, I'm Sally. We talked earlier that I said back in my day, your attire, and maybe bend over a little, she shows her cleavage and she has a very short dress. And in my day, we would say you're asking for it. And I did have an experience, and I knew not to tell my mother. And later on, I was an adult and had grandkids, and I told her, and she still said, well, Sally, you were probably asking for it. You kind of liked him. And so I think that's a lot of reasons why a lot of women don't report. They'll be accused of asking for it, behaving so that they are assaulted.
Yeah, so do you know why I dress this way? So I was sent to really strict Christian schools growing up. And so from kindergarten through 8th grade, I was kindergarten through 6th grade, and then they changed the rules. I wasn't allowed to wear pants because women were only allowed to wear dresses. And I wasn't allowed to show my knees. And so I got written up. I went to high school and I got written up for not dressing modestly enough because they could see my knees. And they called me into the principal's office and they said that I was being a stumbling block to good young Christian men. And I said, clearly, principal, you have not seen these knees. But, and ever since then, it's been a little bit of an act of rebellion for me to show my knees in some of my dresses. But yeah. But what is my rebellion? To other people, that was the way they framed it, is that we were asking for it if we dress this way. And not just that we were asking for it, but we were bringing other people into a state of sin because we make them think sinful thoughts and may make them have commit sinful acts. And so it's very much that framing that my dad did, which is that it's the woman's responsibility to put the fire out. And then one of the ways we do that is by looking like potato sacks. So I tell my daughters, I work with a lot of sex abuse survivors and I study a lot of child sex abuse and, child sex abuse imagery. And I tell my daughters who are 8 and 14 right now that what they dress, what they wear may send messages to other people that they don't intend to send. And so I'm doing the same thing that my dad is doing, but I'm trying to frame it just a little bit differently. Because I really do think that study that showed that, all those guys thought they were wanted when they really weren't, that they can lead to bad things happening. And I think that there's a fine line between blaming the victim and practicing self-defense. And I think it's important to not blame the victim. And I think it's very important to teach both men and women how to be assertive and protect themselves.
Hello there, Professor Bedford. This is Lee over here.
Oh, hi, Lee.
Hi. I want to share my own, I don't know if you want to call it principles or framework, and that is I do not pursue any intimacy outside of an exclusive relationship, number one, and I do it within the framework of dating. Now, in dating, I think that by date number 2, this is just my formula, I would have an open discussion about ground rules of what is comfortable to my female counterpart and what's comfortable for me, and spell it out as to what is appropriate boundaries and what our individual comfort levels are, and that's would be essentially be where I would start the discussion going, so that it isn't like a sneak attack Pearl Harbor type thing.
So date 2?
Yeah, by date 2 to discuss it.
You move fast. That's not an 8-year period.
No, I would discuss it so that beyond date 2, that that we don't come up with any surprises. If we continue to pursue our relationship. And if on date 2 we find we're too far apart, there would be no date 3. That's what I'm saying.
Wow. Yeah, kick him out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, no, rescind.
There you go.
Okay, so that's my formula. I don't know, and I haven't discussed this with anybody else, but I'm sharing it today. Thanks.
Thank you. So what about another scenario? Can you consent to sex if you have had a glass of wine? Yeah. Is it? Yeah. How big is the glass? White wine or red? This is a huge issue that we're dealing with on college campuses. Is he said, sometimes it's she said, but I'm just going to be stereotypical. He said that she consented, and she said, I don't remember consenting. I would never have consented to having sex with you, no matter how drunk I was. And he says, well, I'm sorry, she did. And she says, he sexually assaulted me, and I want to pursue disciplinary action. Like, are you able to give consent if you've been drinking? Have you ever given consent when you weren't drinking? Like, some people are like, no, I always have wine before we have sex. Like, how do you have sex without having a drink beforehand? Anyone?
Personally, I think if you've had a drink, you're impaired to some degree. I don't know how the law looks at that, but it would seem that, yes, there's been a change in your ability to give rational consent.
come on. Of course you can give consent after you've had a glass of wine, maybe even 2 glasses of wine. God forbid, maybe even half a bottle of wine. I mean, it depends on the person. It depends on the circumstances. I mean, yeah, have you had a hamburger with it? Have you had a nice steak? I don't think that there is no hard and fast line, and I think that that is what we're grappling with. You know, the first question, whether you have to have verbal consent or can you consent with body language, my answer is yes, to both of those things. Yes. It's so specific to the circumstances, which is, I think, why we are all grappling so with these issues.
This is Ken. I'm not sure how this impacts the question exactly, but I think some people might have a glass of wine to break down their own internal barriers to go ahead. Certainly from a guy's perspective, and I suspect from the ladies too.
I have a question which is not related to this.
Okay.
But as a lawyer, how do you feel Obama had an executive order that required schools to have public restrooms. Any man or woman, teenage, could enter either bathroom if they felt they were the opposite sex or whatever. And of course, I believe Trump sent an executive order to reverse that. But what is your feeling on that in the high school to permit anyone to enter either a female bathroom or a male bathroom? And if, you know, I find it puzzling why we would go that far.
So I find it to be an incredibly complex and difficult issue because on the one hand, I believe that we should respect how people identify as they have the maturity to identify as male or female so that they're no longer bound by their biological identity that was assigned to them at birth. So I do think it's very important for us to respect people's choices about how they want to identify. So if a person who is born as a man, biologically as a man, chooses to present as a woman, that's his choice. And I want to respect his choice. I'm a bit of a libertarian in that way, and that I like to let people chart their own lives and their own course. I also get incredibly irritated and very resentful when I am watching a Blazers game and all the dudes are coming in and out of the bathroom, and I'm in the meanwhile knees knocked. And I would love to have the ability to go right in there and use their restroom when they have all those stalls open. So, you know, on the one hand, I do that, but I also don't want to embarrass any man when I'm doing that if they're urinals and they don't want to, you know, show their penises in front of me. The other point where I get really worried is with like my daughters at a rest area on the highway where they're going into the bathroom and I want to know that they're safe. And if it is everything's gender neutral and anybody can go in anywhere, then I worry about not the people who identify as, you know, as trans, but people who are using the unisex gender bathrooms as an opportunity to prey on kids, because there are bad people out there. I'm convinced of that after, you know, my years of work in this area. And I'm concerned about that. So I think that the compromise that Willamette has come up with, which is that there are, you know, male bathrooms and there are female bathrooms and there are a ton of unisex bathrooms, so that people who want to go into a unisex bathroom, they have options as well. And so I think that's the solution, but I think it is a really complex solution, and I hate for it to be overly politicized by either side. I think it's important for us to recognize the complexities of that.
Yeah, and I was talking more about high schools as opposed to restrooms on the freeways or college campuses. You know, to have boys decide, I'm going to see what this girl bathroom is like, without them being held responsible for doing that. I don't think I would want my 13-year-old granddaughter to find a man in a girl's bathroom in high school. That's my opinion.
Oh, but I think that we're probably not having the same understanding of the executive order. Men, boys are not allowed to go into the girls' bathrooms under Obama's executive order. It's boys, it's people who are born as boys who over time have come to identify as girls and present as girls. They dress as girls, they act like girls, their closest friends are girls, they might also be boys, but these are people who have developed an identity that's demonstrated over time that the executive order gave them the right to go into the girls' bathroom if they had a public identity as a girl, regardless of what their birth certificate said. That's I'm okay with. What I'm less comfortable with is that scenario that I talked about in my situation where I'm just storming into the boys' bathroom because I want to pee, and I'm embarrassing a bunch of men in front of urinals because they understood that they had privacy in that room, which is, the opposite, I think, of what you're describing with your 13-year-old granddaughter. But I think that the solution is, and high schools have this as well, where they have a unisex bathroom as well, where if people want to go into a bathroom that's unisex, they can do that. And it's open to both, boys and girls. But the executive order didn't allow any boy to go into a girl's bathroom. It only allowed boys who identified as girls over time, and that they were publicly identified as identifying as girls over time. And they couldn't say, well, I'm going to come to school tomorrow and dress like a girl and go in the girl's bathroom. That was not allowed in our high schools ever. It had to be demonstrated over time.
This is Anne.
Uh-huh.
How would Willamette answer the questions you put up there?
Well, that's where I got some of these questions, is because we've been wrestling with these questions at Willamette, that we have a lot of, no more than any other college in America, but we have a lot of allegations of sexual assault in college. And one of the biggest misunderstandings, and one of the things that leads to someone believing that they've been sexually assaulted and the other person not realizing that they were being perceived as sexually assaulting, is that they were relying on body language, or they were relying on consent to do something else. So that, for example, someone consents to vaginal sex, missionary style, and then the guy flips her over, and she's, letting him have sex doggy style, and then all of a sudden he starts to try and anally penetrate her. And all of a sudden she's like, he raped me. And it's like, well, you already had sex with him in 2 positions. What do you mean he raped you? It's like, I never consented to anal sex. And so it's like, you can't assume that because he or she has said yes, and I'll say he, I asked about erections earlier, we've had instances of men being sexually assaulted, and it's like, but you had an erection. It's like, because I had an erection did not mean I wanted to have sex with you. I had an erection because you were forcing yourself on my penis and you were, getting a physical, response to that. But that's not mentally what I wanted. So this consent issue is a huge one, and one that we're having a whole educational effort around at colleges all across America, is encouraging people to talk about sex, to express in their consent, verbal and physical, so that there are no mistakes. With regard to the drinking, we really did have administrators who are like, I never have sex without drinking. Like, we've been married for 20 years. We always have sex. We always drink before we have sex. Like, I can't imagine what an alcohol-less, experience would be like. And so when we started talking about the importance of sobriety when we're having sex, where we've really drawn the line there, is that you have to make sure that the other person has enough capacity to give informed consent. For me, I don't drink. So 1 glass of wine might impair my ability. For somebody else, they might drink regularly. So they might be able to have 4 or 5 glasses of wine and still be able to have capacity to consent. So again, it depends on the circumstances on the individual. One of the, one of the things that I got in trouble for was that we had an instance where someone was drunk on 2 different occasions, and sexual assaults happened on, allegedly on both occasions. And I'm like, so at what point are you going to stop drinking, and passing out in other people's rooms? And it's just like, no, you don't ever blame the victim. And I'm thinking, okay, but I absolutely hold this boy responsible, this young man responsible. I think he should absolutely be disciplined. I think that maybe she should even take, criminal action against him. But I also think that we need to teach both men and women, girls and boys, to actively protect ourselves and not to put ourselves in positions where we are likely to be taken advantage of, or we are likely to be assaulted or abused. That is too widespread for us to just trust people to do the right thing. So we tell people, make sure that the other person has capacity and that they really are able to give knowing consent, because if you get it wrong, we're going to side with them, because it's the person who is initiating that we're holding responsible to make sure they have consent. And then, what was, oh, okay. And this one, we don't have a really good, I don't have a really good example of this. I really did take it from the Aziz Ansari scenario. We haven't really dealt with this, but this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges in this state in history, is to figure out that difference between persuasion and coercion. I have a super strong personality, so I just wear people down all the time in every area of my life. It's just I get my way a lot, and I get my way a lot sometimes by being persuasive, and when that doesn't work, I coerce them, and it's just is that wrong? And then I think, well, it might be in certain relationships where there's a power differential and where people feel taken advantage of at the end. Like the people who sold us their house, they still resent me because I just kept asking for more and more and more and more repairs. And they started to realize that I wasn't going to stop asking till they said no. So they did $30,000 of repairs that they otherwise wouldn't have done. Is that a bad thing? It's did I make them? And and so I think that we get into this whole thing about how do we self-regulate in different areas of our life so that people don't feel like we've taken advantage of them because we have more power than they do, because we have more endurance than they do, because we are more determined than they are, because they're more vulnerable than we are. And I think it's really important for us to check ourselves so that we create equality in all of our relationships, whether it's a professor or a student, whether it's a wife and her husband, whether it is, parents and their children. It doesn't mean that you have to do what your children always tell you to do, but it means that, we have to empower them to a point that they feel respected by us and that they'll be heard, and that if they say no, and it's something other than they need to clean the room, that we will respect them. Any other questions?
Well, Professor Binford, thank you so much for this illuminating and thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.
Just there. Okay. Thank you.